Imagine soaring through the clouds in a fighter plane, but instead of sitting on an engine, you are perched on the back of a 10-ton, pilotless bomber. You aren't just flying your own aircraft. You are driving a massive, decapitated beast. This was the Mistel, or mistletoe, one of the most surreal and desperate engineering feats of the Luftwaffe during the final years of World War II. At first glance, it looked like a mechanical parasite. A sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf Fw 190 fighter was bolted to the top of a Junkers Ju-88 bomber via a complex tripod of steel struts. But this wasn't a standard transport configuration. The Ju-88 had been surgically altered. Its entire cockpit and nose section were removed and replaced by a gargantuan, 4-ton shaped charge. This wasn't just a big bomb, it was a specialized Beethoven device designed to punch through several meters of reinforced concrete or the thickest armor plating of an Allied battleship. The nose of the bomber featured a long, protruding stinger, or hollow charge probe. Upon impact, this probe would trigger the massive explosive, focusing the blast into a molten jet of metal that could melt through almost anything in its path. The pilot sat in the fighter on top, controlling both aircraft simultaneously through a complex umbilical system of electrical and hydraulic cables. The fighter's controls were slave to the bomber's control surfaces, allowing the pilot to fly the entire 20-ton composite as if it were a single, ungainly machine. The plan was a masterclass in aerodynamic audacity. The pilot would fly the Mistel toward the target, enter a shallow dive, lock the bomber's controls on a terminal course, and then, at the last possible second, trigger the explosive bolts to detach his fighter and peel away, leaving the headless bomber to act as a giant, guided torpedo. It was the ultimate fire-and-forget weapon of a dying regime. The Mistel was a terrifying admission that the Luftwaffe had lost the ability to win conventional dogfights and was now resorting to robot warfare. It was a flying guillotine, designed to decapitate the Allied advance, and it remains one of the most bizarre sights ever to haunt the skies of Europe. The Mistel wasn't born from a dream of innovation, it was born from the stench of defeat. By 1943, the German High Command realized their conventional bombing fleet was being slaughtered by Allied air superiority. They needed a way to deliver a knockout blow to massive targets, Soviet bridges, hydroelectric dams, and British battleships, without sending dozens of bombers into a meat grinder. The answer was the Beethoven Gerät, Beethoven device, a project led by the engineers at Junkers who envisioned a composite aircraft that could turn obsolete bombers into precision-guided sledgehammers. The face of this desperate gambit was the elite Luftwaffe test pilot and instructor, Siegfried Holzbauer. While many pilots looked at the Mistel and saw a death trap, Holzbauer saw a technical challenge that required ice in the veins. To fly a Mistel, a pilot couldn't just be an ace, they had to be a master of multi-engine synchronization. Imagine trying to balance a bicycle on top of a moving truck while steering both from the bicycle's handlebars. That was the reality for the Mistel pilots. These men weren't just random recruits. They were often seasoned veterans who understood the grim mathematics of the war's final stages. They trained in secret, practicing the separation maneuver, the heart-stopping moment when explosive bolts would fire, hopefully pushing the fighter away from the bomber rather than slamming the two together in mid-air. The psychological toll was immense. They were essentially flying a 4-ton bomb that sat just a few feet beneath their cockpit floor. A single electrical short or a stray bullet from a roaming P-51 Mustang wouldn't just damage the plane. It would trigger a blast that would erase everything within a 100-yard radius. The project was shrouded in Wunderwaffe, wonder weapon, secrecy. The pilots lived in a world of high-stakes experimentation, knowing that they were the Reich's last hope to stall the Soviet steamroller. They were told that the Mistel was the ultimate precision tool, a way to surgically strike the bridges over the Vistula and the Oder to stop the Red Army. But as Holzbauer and his men looked at the slow, lumbering composite sitting on the tarmac, they knew the truth. They were being asked to fly a high-tech suicide mission in a sky that no longer belonged to them. They were the conductors of a Beethoven symphony of fire, prepared to play the final notes of a collapsing empire. The theory of the Mistel was finally put to the ultimate test during the chaotic aftermath of D-Day. On the night of June 24, 1944, the Luftwaffe launched its first major parasite strike against the Allied invasion fleet anchored off the coast of Normandy. Among the targets was the HMS Nith, a British River-class frigate acting as a control ship. To the sailors on deck, the sight that emerged from the twilight was like something out of a fever dream. a massive, twin-engine bomber diving toward them with a smaller fighter plane seemingly fused to its spine. From the cockpit of the Bf-109 perched on top, the German pilot was fighting a mechanical nightmare. At high speeds, the aerodynamics of the Mistel became wildly unpredictable. The air flowing over the fighter's wings was disrupted by the massive bulk of the Ju-88 beneath it, creating a buffeting effect that threatened to shake the entire composite apart. The pilot had to manually align the long Stinger probe on the bomber's nose with the silhouette of the ship, all while battling the heavy, sluggish response of a 20-ton flying bomb. As the HMS Nith's anti-aircraft guns began to scream, filling the sky with tracer fire, the German pilot reached the point of no return. He slammed the release trigger. The explosive bolts fired with a bone-jarring thud, and the fighter was kicked upward as the Ju-88 was released into its terminal glide. For a few terrifying seconds, the bomber transformed into a 4-ton robot torpedo, hurtling through the air at over 300 miles per hour, guided only by the momentum the pilot had given it. The Ju-88 struck the water just short of the HMS Nith, but the momentum carried the massive-shaped charge directly into the ship's side. The explosion was unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. Because it was a Beethoven device, the blast didn't just expand outward, it focused into a terrifying, concentrated jet of thermal energy. The shaped charge punched a hole through the hull, vaporizing steel and sending a shockwave through the ship that killed 9 sailors instantly and wounded nearly 30 more. The HMS Nith didn't sink. The Stinger had missed the vital engine rooms by a few meters, but the ship was effectively neutralized, forced to be towed back to England for massive repairs. The German pilot, meanwhile, banked his fighter hard and vanished into the darkness, having completed the first drone strike in naval history. It was a partial victory, but it proved the terrifying potential of the Parasite. A single headless bomber had done more damage than a dozen conventional planes, leaving the Allied High Command wondering if they had just witnessed the future of air warfare. While the attack on the HMS Nith proved the Mistel could be lethal, it also exposed a fatal flaw that turned the project into a massacre for the Luftwaffe. The Beethoven composite was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was an aerodynamic disaster in a dogfight. By 1944, the Allies had achieved total air supremacy. The skies over Europe were thick with P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires, fast, agile hunters that were specifically looking for anything that moved. To these Allied pilots, discovering a Mistel in flight was like a wolf finding a crippled, overweight sheep. A Mistel combo was a sitting duck. Because the fighter on top was carrying the weight of a fully loaded bomber and 10 tons of explosives, its top speed was slashed by nearly 40%. It couldn't turn, it couldn't dive away, and it couldn't climb. If an Allied fighter appeared on the horizon, the Mistel pilot faced a horrific choice. He could stay attached and try to reach his target, knowing he was a massive, slow-moving target, or he could jettison the multi-million-mark bomber early to save his own life, effectively wasting the mission and the weapon. This became the crisis point for the Luftwaffe's Kampfgeschwader 200, the secret unit flying these machines. The missions were supposed to be standoff strikes, but the range of the radio-guided tech was short, forcing the Mistels to fly dangerously close to the front lines. On several occasions, entire Mistel wings were intercepted before they even reached the English Channel. The result was a series of spectacular, terrifying mid-air explosions. A single burst of .50 caliber fire from a Mustang into the belly of the Ju-88 wouldn't just bring down the plane, it would trigger the 4-ton shaped charge. The resulting blast was so violent it would often vaporize the attacking Allied fighter along with the Mistel, creating a black hole in the sky that left no wreckage behind. The pilots began to realize they were flying suicide missions in everything but name. The stress of steering a 10-ton bomb through a sky filled with hunters turned their hair gray in weeks. They were ordered to fly at night or in thick cloud cover to hide, but the weight of the Mistel made flying in bad weather a death sentence. The Beethoven symphony was falling out of tune. The German High Command was demanding results, but the reality was that they were sending their best pilots into a meat grinder, riding on the back of a weapon that was simply too slow for the world it was born into. The Mistel had become a symbol of the Reich's desperation, a high-tech marvel that was being swatted out of the sky by the sheer weight of Allied numbers. As the Allied and Soviet pincers closed in on Germany, the Mistel was transitioned from a naval hunter to a desperate defensive barrier. The mission was now Operation Iron Hammer, a plan to use the Parasite planes to destroy the vital bridges over the Oder and Vistula rivers, stalling the Soviet Red Army's advance on Berlin. The German High Command believed that if they could just drop the massive spans of these bridges into the water using the Beethoven-shaped charges, they could buy the Reich enough time to negotiate or deploy even more radical wonder weapons. But the reality on the ground, and in the air, was a catastrophe. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe was operating from improvised grass strips and bombed-out airfields. Launching a 20-ton composite aircraft required a long, pristine runway. On the rough, muddy fields of the Eastern Front, Mistels frequently suffered landing gear collapses before they even left the ground. Of the hundreds of Mistels planned, only a fraction ever reached the combat zone. The bridge strikes became a testament to the futility of the project. In one of the final major sorties against the Soviet bridgeheads at Kustrin, a wave of Mistels was dispatched under the cover of twilight. The pilots were exhausted, flying planes that had been cannibalized for parts. As they approached the target, they were met with a wall of Soviet anti-aircraft fire so dense it was described as a curtain of steel. The slow-moving composites were easy prey. Most of the pilots were forced to release their bombers miles from the bridges just to gain enough maneuverability to dodge the flak. One Ju-88 did manage to strike a bridge directly, detonating its 4-ton charge with a blast that shook the earth for miles. But even here, the Beethoven device proved to be too specialized. The shaped charge was designed to punch a narrow molten hole through thick armor, not to knock down an entire structural span. The bridge was damaged, its girders twisted and scorched, but it remained standing. Within hours, Soviet engineers had laid planks over the hole, and the tank columns continued to roll toward Berlin. The project had failed its ultimate test. The Mistel was a precision instrument being used as a sledgehammer, and the math simply didn't work. By the time the final Soviet assault on Berlin began, the remaining Mistels sat abandoned on airfields, their Stinger probes rusting in the rain. The pilots who survived the Beethoven project realized that they had been part of a technological ghost story, a weapon that looked terrifying on paper but was ultimately a hollow threat against the industrial might of the Allies. The story of the Mistel did not end in the mud of a collapsed Eastern Front. When Allied intelligence teams and Soviet trophy brigades began sweeping through captured German airfields in 1945, they found these strange, double-decker hulks and were baffled. They weren't just looking at a desperate weapon, they were looking at the crude, mechanical blueprints for the future of global warfare. The Mistel was the bridge between the age of the suicide pilot and the age of the precision-guided munition. The legacy of the Mistel is essentially the birth of the standoff weapon. For the first time, engineers had successfully separated the delivery vehicle from the pilot's life. The concept of a mothership launching a high-speed, unmanned bomb is exactly how modern cruise missiles operate today. In a twisted way, the German pilot sitting on top of that Ju-88 was a human microprocessor, a biological computer doing the job that GPS and laser guidance systems would take over decades later. Furthermore, the Mistel remains the most terrifying and successful example of Parasite aircraft ever built. While the Americans and Soviets would later experiment with trapeze fighters, small jets carried in the bellies of massive bombers, none ever reached the raw, destructive scale of the Mistel. It stands as a monument to a specific brand of wartime madness, the belief that you could solve a lack of resources with sheer aerodynamic audacity. It proved that if you were desperate enough, you could turn a graveyard of obsolete planes into a fleet of robot assassins. Today, the Beethoven project is a favorite subject for military historians and model builders because of its visual wrongness. It looks like a glitch in the history of aviation, a combination that shouldn't fly, carrying a bomb that shouldn't exist. But its influence is felt every time a modern drone is launched from the wing of a larger carrier. The Mistel taught the world that the most dangerous part of a plane wasn't the pilot, but the payload, and that if you could find a way to leave the human behind, the possibilities for destruction were limitless. The mistletoe never saved the Reich, and it never turned the tide of the war. Instead, it left behind a grim warning: that technology will always evolve to remove the human element from the moment of impact. The Mistel was the first step toward a world where wars are fought by machines, steered by ghosts, launched from the backs of giants. It was a bizarre, terrifying, and ultimately futile experiment that remains one of the most haunting what-ifs of World War II.